You hear about them all the time. They're right there in the news headlines, woven into political speeches, almost always framed as, well, a big problem.
Yeah, a sign of weakness, maybe. Something threatening jobs or even the country's future.
We're talking about trade deficits.
Hmm.
And honestly, with all the noise around them, it can feel confusing, maybe even a little alarming.
It taps into a very intuitive idea, doesn't it? Like running a household budget where you're spending more than you earn.
Exactly.
It feels unsustainable, like you're piling up debt you can't handle. So when you apply that thinking to a whole country importing more than it exports, well, the concern feels pretty natural.
Exactly that feeling. And that's why we're taking a deep dive today. We're going to pull back from that standard narrative and really dig into what trade deficits actually are.
Especially looking through a lens that's quite different from the mainstream view.
Right. We'll be exploring the perspective of economist Warren Mosler and the framework of modern monetary theory, or MMT.
And we've gathered a really compelling stack of source material for this. We've got excerpts from a detailed piece deconstructing the financial mechanics of U.S. debt and trade. A key chapter from a book on MMT focusing specifically on trade deficits, and transcripts from conversations featuring Mosler himself, along with other economists like Steve Keen, who offer, slightly varied takes.
It's a set of sources that really does offer a fundamentally different way of looking at this topic than the one you typically encounter.
Definitely.
So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack these materials, understand the actual financial plumbing behind the trade numbers.
Yeah, the nuts and bolts.
Challenge some deeply held assumptions about them. Explore some interesting nuances, even among economists who share a similar starting point, and really see why the common story might be completely upside down, particularly for a country like the United States that issues its own currency.
Okay. We're aiming for clarity, some unexpected insights, and hopefully that feeling of really getting a complex topic.
Okay, let's get into it then. The concerns people have, which are definitely reflected in the sources we're looking at, are powerful.
Oh, yeah. You hear that trade deficits mean we're losing jobs, that we're borrowing excessively from foreigners.
That they signal national decline,
Yeah.
or that they're just financially unsustainable.
And these fears, they're often the driving force behind calls for protectionist measures, right? Like tariffs or trade barriers.
Right, trying to put up walls because you feel like you're being taken advantage of or losing something. But the sources we have immediately signal that the MMT framework offers a radically different perspective here.
Particularly, and this is crucial, for a nation that is monetarily sovereign.
And monetarily sovereign is key here. What does that mean? Again, exactly.
It means the government issues its own currency. It doesn't promise to convert it to anything else like gold or foreign currency. And crucially, it doesn't have significant debt denominated in a foreign currency. For such a country, MMT starts with a foundational concept about trade. And it's perhaps the most counterintuitive part when you view it in real terms.
Okay. I'm ready for the counterintuitive part. Lay it on me.
That imports are real benefits and exports are real costs.
Wait, exports are costs. And that goes against everything you typically hear. Exports are good, right? They mean we're selling things, earning money.
That's the conventional financial view, yeah. Focusing on income and balance sheets. But the MMT perspective, as laid out in these sources, asks you to think about the real resources involved.
Real resources.
Yeah.
Like labor and materials.
Exactly. When you import goods and services, your citizens get to use them, consume them, benefit from them right now. That's a tangible addition to your available stuff, your living standards.
Okay, that makes sense. You get the thing.
But when you export, you are using your own labor, your own factories, your own land, your real resources to produce things that are then sent away for others to consume. That's a use of your limited domestic real resources that you don't get to keep.
Okay, I see the logic. It's about what you actually have available to use domestically. If you're exporting, you're using up resources you could have used for yourself, but you're sending them away instead.
Precisely. There's a quote from Mosler in the sources that nails this. In economics, it's better to receive than to give. Therefore, imports are real benefits. Exports are real costs. The real wealth of a nation is all it produces and keeps for itself, plus all it imports, minus what it must export.
Wow. So from this viewpoint, a trade deficit, bringing in more real stuff than you send out, actually enhances your current domestic living standards.
Directly. And the availability of goods and services. You're getting a net inflow of real wealth in terms of stuff you can use right now.
That really flips the script. It makes you question that gut feeling that a deficit is always bad. The sources use an analogy about trade wars here that's quite striking, don't they?
Yes, Musler often uses the example of Japan sending vast numbers of cars and electronics to the U.S. over decades,
Right, I remember that period.
receiving comparatively little back in terms of U.S. real goods. The common narrative frames this as Japan winning and the U.S. losing some kind of economic battle.
Because Japan was the big exporter, building all that product, employing people.
Right, but the MMT reframing challenges you to look at what each country actually ended up with in real terms.
Okay.
The U.S. got millions of physical, usable cars, TVs, VCRs back then, a massive tangible addition to their capital stock and consumption possibilities.
Real stuff.
Real stuff. Japan got U.S. dollar financial assets. Claims on future U.S. output, yes, but for the moment, primarily digital entries or bits of paper. Mosler's provocative comparison is to war reparations. If the U.S. had forced Japan to send all those cars for free after World War II, it would clearly be seen as the U.S. benefiting, exploiting Japan even.
Absolutely.
Yet when Japan does it voluntarily in exchange for dollar assets, it's often seen through the conventional lens as Japan winning a trade war. It makes you ask, what is the actual benefit being exchanged here?
That is a powerful reframing. Seriously. Okay, so if imports are a real benefit and exports a real cost, how does the money side of this actually work? Especially, how foreigners end up with dollars?
Yeah.
That's where the deconstructing U.S. debt source is really helpful, right?
It is. It breaks down the mechanics of the financial transactions beautifully. Let's walk through their example. A U.S. consumer buys a German car.
Okay, U.S. consumer, German car, money has to move.
Right. Scenario 1. The consumer pays cash. Their U.S. bank account gets debited.
Okay.
The German car manufacturer's bank account, which will be at a U.S. bank or have access to the U.S. payment system through another bank, gets credited.
So the German company now holds a U.S. dollar deposit.
Correct. And what's key here is that the total amount of deposits in the U.S. banking system hasn't changed. It's just moved from a U.S. residence account to a foreign residence account.
Okay, the dollar's just shifted ownership, internationally speaking.
Exactly. Now, scenario 2. Consider if the consumer borrows to buy the car, which is, very common.
Right. Auto loans.
The U.S. bank extends a loan to the consumer. This is an asset for the bank. Simultaneously, it creates a new deposit for the consumer that's a liability for the bank. And as the source emphasizes, loans create deposits.
Loans create deposits. Got it.
The consumer then uses this new deposit to pay the German car maker.
Wow.
The German car maker gets a new USD deposit. So in this scenario, the U.S. consumer's act of borrowing increased the total amount of deposits in the U.S. banking system.
And that increase is what the foreign entity ends up holding as a U.S. dollar saving.
Precisely. So the money that the foreigner ends up holding in dollars isn't necessarily drawn from some existing pool of savings that the U.S. somehow had to borrow.
It can be created domestically by the banking system when the domestic spending happens.
Wow. That's a crucial takeaway from understanding the financial mechanics. The finance behind the trade gap is fundamentally driven by foreigners desiring to accumulate net savings in U.S. dollar financial assets. They are selling goods and services to the U.S. to obtain those assets.
Okay, so it's driven by their desire to save dollars. And often they don't just hold those dollars as bank deposits, right? They might buy U.S. Treasury securities. How does that transaction work?
Right. So when a foreign holder of USD deposits buys a Treasury security, they are essentially just swapping one type of dollar asset for another.
Okay.
Their USD deposit is transferred to the seller of the security, who's probably a U.S. resident or institution, and the foreigner receives the Treasury security.
Or they buy it directly from the Treasury.
Or they buy direct from the Treasury. In that case, the foreign holder's bank account at the Fed is debited, the Treasury's account at the Fed is credited, and the foreigner gets the security. Still an asset swap, essentially.
And this is the origin of that whole widely discussed idea that the U.S. is a debtor nation, particularly to countries like China or Japan who hold lots of treasuries.
It is. And while it's technically true that the U.S. government has liabilities, these treasuries denominated in its own currency held by foreign entities, the source encourages us to look at what the U.S. government actually owes on that Treasury security.
Okay, what does it owe?
Ab surety, the government doesn't owe foreign currency or gold or anything like that. Its obligation is simply to credit the foreign holder's bank's reserve account at the Fed.
Right.
And debit their security account at the Fed.
So it's just swapping one type of dollar-denominated asset, the Treasury, for another, which is bank reserves, basically, the bank's money at the Fed.
Exactly that, an asset swap. The source is very clear on this point. This is not a potential source of financial stress for the government. Because the government issues the currency, it can always perform this swap.
There's no risk of it running out of dollars to do it.
Nope.
That's a really fundamental difference compared to how we usually think about debt, isn't it? Like a household owing money, or a company, or even a state government.
Yeah.
They have to find the money.
Yeah.
Earn it, borrow it from someone else.
Absolutely.
But the issuer of the currency is in a completely different position.
It is, and misunderstanding that distinction is really central to many of the innocent frauds Mosler discusses. Okay, let's move on to another major concern, jobs.
Ah, yes, the big one.
It's very common to hear that trade deficits destroy domestic jobs because imports replace goods that could have been made here.
And the sources acknowledge this concern, right? They note that imports can displace workers in specific industries or regions that compete directly with those imports. That's a real impact on people's lives.
They do acknowledge that localized impact, absolutely. However, the crucial MMT argument presented is that overall unemployment in a monetarily sovereign nation is not an inevitable consequence of a trade deficit.
But how can that be? If some jobs are lost to imports, doesn't that automatically increase overall unemployment?
Not necessarily. The MMT perspective says that a government issuing its own currency can use fiscal policy, adjusting taxes or government spending to ensure there is always sufficient aggregate demand in the economy to employ everyone willing and able to work.
Okay.
And this capacity exists regardless of the trade balance.
So even if imports satisfy some demand, the government can use its spending power to generate demand elsewhere in the economy, effectively soaking up the available domestic labor.
That's the core idea. Mosler is quoted explicitly stating this. All we have to do is keep American spending power high enough to be able to buy both what foreigners want to sell us, A&E, all the goods and services that we can produce ourselves at full employment levels. So from this view, if there is widespread unemployment, it's not because imports inevitably took the jobs away. It's framed as a failure of domestic policy to maintain sufficient aggregate demand to keep the economy at full employment.
Okay, so the job issue, while real for specific individuals and industries, is framed as fundamentally a matter of domestic fiscal policy capacity, not an inherent outcome of the trade balance itself.
Precisely. Which allows us to circle back to that idea of borrowing from abroad, financing our consumption with foreign money.
Yeah, it's such a persistent narrative.
Yeah.
The U.S. spends too much, doesn't save enough, so it has to borrow from China or whoever just to keep going.
And as we saw with the financial mechanics, MMT offers a different interpretation. When the U.S. runs a trade deficit, foreigners accumulate U.S. dollar financial assets. Why? Because they're earning more dollars from their exports to the U.S. than they're spending on U.S. exports or other U.S. assets.
They're getting dollars because we bought their stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the MMT view is that this isn't the U.S. needing foreign savings to fund its domestic consumption or investment. It's not like we need their money first.
Okay.
Instead, it reflects the rest of the world's collective desire to net save in U.S. dollar financial assets. For the rest of the world as a whole to increase its net holdings of USD assets, the U.S. financial system must accommodate that desire. And how does it do that? By running a current account deficit, which includes the trade balance as a major component. It's an accounting identity, basically.
So it's less about the U.S. being dependent on foreign money and more about the rest of the world wanting dollar assets and the U.S. providing those assets through the trade deficit mechanism.
That's the shift in perspective. The sources highlight that domestic credit creation, like that loan for the imported car we talked about, enables the purchase of imports. And the foreign exporter ends up with the dollar asset they desired. The U.S. isn't dependent on foreign savings to finance that purchase. The transaction happens within the dollar system, accommodating the foreign desire to save dollars.
That really does reframe the whole debtor nation idea. It suggests the foreign holding of dollars and treasuries is more a reflection of their choices and desires than our operational necessity.
Exactly, which then leads logically to the question of sustainability. Is a trade deficit unsustainable?
Yeah, that's the common fear, isn't it? Eventually, you can't pay back what you owe. The piper must be paid.
But again, for a monetarily sovereign nation with a floating exchange rate, it's not unsustainable in the sense of financial solvency. The U.S. government can always create the dollars necessary to meet its dollar obligations, like we discussed with the Treasury example.
Right, the asset swap.
There's no risk of financial default in its own currency. That's just not how it works operationally.
Okay, but what about the value of the dollar itself? If foreigners are holding more and more dollars, could that cause problems down the line?
It could certainly affect the exchange rate. That's the market mechanism. If the rest of the world's desire to hold U.S. dollar assets weakens, maybe they think the U.S. economy isn't looking so good, or another currency looks more attractive.
They might sell dollars.
They might start selling dollars to buy other currencies. Yeah, this would put downward pressure on the dollar's exchange rate, causing it to depreciate.
And dollar depreciation makes U.S. exports cheaper for foreigners and imports more expensive for Americans.
Right. And this is a market adjustment mechanism that can adjust the trade balance over time. It might make U.S. goods more competitive and imported goods less attractive.
So it might shrink the deficit.
It might. The sources emphasize that this is an exchange rate adjustment mechanism, not a solvency crisis. It's different. While exchange rate movements definitely have real impacts, they can affect import prices, potentially leading to inflation, and they alter the terms of trade, how much stuff you get for your stuff. It's not the same as a government being unable to meet its financial obligations in its own currency.
Gotcha. And the sources also make a point of distinguishing this financial sustainability from real resource sustainability, right?
Correct. That's an important distinction. There are legitimate policy concerns about real resource dependencies.
Like what?
Well, for instance, relying too heavily on imports for strategically vital goods like, say, rare earth minerals or certain pharmaceuticals or maybe even microchips. That could be seen as a vulnerability for national security, regardless of the financial accounting.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or if the trade deficit was coupled with a genuine long-term decline in domestic productive capacity that policymakers wanted to reverse for social or regional reasons, these are real issues, absolutely. But they are distinct from the government's financial capacity to manage its currency and its debts denominated in that currency.
Okay, so financial solvency isn't the issue, but real dependencies might be. Now, let's tackle another common fear. What if foreign holders, especially big ones like governments, decide to suddenly dump their U.S. assets, like all those treasuries?
Yeah, the China dumps treasuries scenario.
Manic.
Well, the MMT response, again, is rooted in understanding the financial mechanics. Foreign holders of dollar assets, treasuries, deposits, whatever, already have the dollars. They acquired them through trade or other transactions previously.
Okay, they already hold dollar assets, so selling treasuries doesn't mean they're suddenly pulling cash out of the U.S. system.
No. If they sell their treasuries, they are selling them to someone else who wants to hold a dollar-denominated asset. Could be another private sector entity, an individual, a bank, a pension fund, another foreign entity maybe, or potentially the Federal Reserve itself, if it chose to step in and buy them. As the source explains, it's an asset swap within the U.S. dollar system.
They exchange a treasury security for what? A bank deposit?
Right.
Or reserves held at the Fed?
Exactly. They swap an interest-bearing treasury for a non-interest-bearing deposit or reserve balance. The dollars don't leave the U.S. financial system itself.
So the system just reconfigures who holds which type of dollar asset.
Pretty much. Now, if foreigners collectively decided to sell all their dollar assets, treasuries, stocks, everything, and then try to buy foreign currency with those dollars,
That'll be different.
that would, as we discussed, cause significant downward pressure on the dollar exchange rate. The dollar would likely fall, maybe sharply, but it still doesn't operationally prevent the U.S. government from issuing dollars or spending domestically. Its ability to function isn't contingent on foreign willingness to buy its debt.
That's a huge point. Okay, this all brings us to a really interesting part of the sources, the discussion, featuring Warren Mosler and Steve Keen.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
They share a lot of common ground in understanding these MMT principles, but they explore some areas where their perspectives diverge slightly, which is really helpful.
It's valuable because it shows that even within a shared framework, there are points of emphasis and, potential disagreement, which helps us think more deeply. They agree on the operational realities of sovereign currency and the non-binding nature of financial constraints on the government.
But one area of difference that comes up in their conversation is Steve Keen's perspective on how trade surpluses in other countries can impact their central banks and money creation.
Yes. Keen argues that persistent trade surpluses can effectively force central banks in the surplus countries to create their domestic currency. Well, foreigners acquire the surplus country's currency, let's say, euros, by selling imports there. Then those foreigners want to sell those euros to buy their own currencies. If the European Central Bank tries to prevent the euro from appreciating rapidly, which would hurt exporters.
Right, make their goods expensive.
It has to step in. It has to create euros and use them to buy the foreign currency assets being offered. He sees this as a significant, almost forced channel of money creation for those central banks, alongside bank lending and domestic government spending.
Okay, I think I follow. And Mosler's counter to that.
Mosler views this not as an inevitable outcome of the trade surplus itself, but as a result of a discretionary policy choice by the central bank.
A choice to intervene.
Exactly. A choice to intervene in the foreign exchange market to manage the exchange rate. If the central bank chose not to intervene, the private sector would handle the currency exchange. The euro would likely appreciate more, but it wouldn't necessarily involve net money creation by the central bank in the way Keene describes it. It would largely be asset swaps between private accounts.
So the disagreement is on whether it's a mechanical necessity of the surplus or a government policy response to the surplus.
Pretty much, yeah. A difference in emphasis on whether it's an automatic outcome or a policy decision.
Okay. What about the real costs of trade deficits? That seems to be another point of nuanced difference between them in the discussion.
Right. Mosler's primary focus, as we've discussed, is on the terms of trade itself, what real goods you get for what real goods you send out. The real cost is the labor and resources used to produce exports.
But Keene raises concerns about the long-term effects, doesn't he? Particularly for countries that aren't the global reserve currency issuer like the U.S.
Right. Keene expresses concern that continuous trade deficits can lead to increasing foreign ownership of domestic assets industries, farmland, real estate. He argues that this results in a persistent outflow of profits and dividends back to the foreign owners, which he sees as a significant real cost. He argues it can hinder domestic investment, potentially crowd out domestic businesses, and over time erode a nation's domestic productive capacity. He uses Australia as an example where he believes this has happened.
So he sees the consequences of the deficit, like foreign ownership, and the resulting profit outflow as a material, long-term, real cost that maybe Mosler emphasizes less.
Exactly. Mosler's counterpoint, especially for a currency issuer like the U.S., is that foreign ownership isn't really a constraint on domestic investment because the operational capacity to invest domestically isn't limited by foreign funding or ownership patterns. The government can always finance domestic activity. He acknowledges the profit outflow happens, but maintains the primary real cost discussion should focus on the terms of trade itself, the real stuff exchanged. It's a valuable discussion because it highlights different potential real costs and implications stemming from trade imbalances, even when operating from a shared MMT foundation.
It really shows how applying the framework can lead to different conclusions or points of emphasis about specific long-term dynamics. And understanding these financial dynamics, or maybe more importantly, misunderstanding them, has real-world consequences for policy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The sources connect this directly to what Mosler labels innocent frauds, these deeply ingrained but flawed beliefs about government finance and trade that lead to counterproductive policies.
Like the idea we talked about earlier that the government needs to pay for everything it spends, usually by taxing or borrowing from the public first.
Yes. This narrative, fueled by that flawed household budget analogy, leads to policies where crucial public investments, like maybe infrastructure bills or green energy projects, get debated endlessly in terms of how they'll be paid for.
Right.
It creates political constraints that aren't actually operational constraints for a sovereign currency issuer. As the sources discuss, the constraint is often self-imposed, political like a debt ceiling or the EU's 3% deficit rule, not an inherent financial inability to spend its own currency.
And this misunderstanding also infirms trade policy, like the use of tariffs, which the sources mention in the context of, say, the Trump administration's actions.
Exactly. Tariffs are often politically popular because they seem like a direct way to fix the trade deficit or punish trading partners. It looks like you're doing something.
Right, taking action.
But the MMT analysis presented in the sources suggests that tariffs, rather than fixing a fundamental problem, can actually harm the domestic economy. How? By slowing trade, contributing to price increases for consumers and businesses.
Making imports more expensive.
Right, which negatively alters the terms of trade. You pay more for the same stuff. And they can potentially lead to retaliatory tariffs from other countries, hurting your exporters. The sources note the political appeal of doing something often overrides a clear analysis of the actual economic effects, which, from this perspective, are often detrimental despite being framed as addressing a perceived problem, the trade deficit itself.
It really highlights how focusing on the wrong problem, maybe based on a flawed financial model, can lead to policies that completely miss the mark or even make things worse. The historical examples mentioned in the sources also seem to underscore this point.
They do. The sources point out, for instance, that the U.S. had a massive trade deficit back in 1999.
Yep.
But that coincided with strong economic growth and low unemployment. Why? Well, that period was largely fueled by a boom in private sector debt and spending.
So,
Conversely, periods of economic weakness, like after 2001 or especially in 2008, weren't really caused by sudden spikes in the trade deficit. They were driven more by dynamics like the collapse of that private sector debt bubble, or perhaps insufficient government deficit spending relative to the private sector's desire to save and the foreign sector's desire to net save dollars.
so it suggests domestic fiscal policy and private sector financial balances are far more determinative of overall economic health for a sovereign issuer than the trade balance itself.
That's the strong implication, yes.
Okay, let's try and bring the core MMT points on trade deficits from these sources together, just to really solidify the perspective shift we've been exploring.
Okay, so point one. For this viewpoint, a trade deficit means the nation is receiving a net inflow of real goods and services from the rest of the world.
Stuff. Real stuff.
In tangible terms, that's a current benefit to consumption and potentially investment. More stuff available.
And financially, it's the accounting outcome, the mere image of the rest of the world choosing to accumulate net financial assets denominated in the deficit country's currency, like dollars.
Correct. It reflects their saving desire. Point three. For a monetarily sovereign nation, trade deficits do not inherently cause overall unemployment.
That's a function of domestic fiscal policy ensuring sufficient aggregate demand.
Got it.
Point four. They are not financially unsustainable for the sovereign issuer in its own currency. The government can always meet its dollar obligations.
So concerns about sustainability should properly focus on things like real resource dependencies or maybe potential exchange rate impacts or the terms of trade. It's not on the government's ability to pay back its debt in dollars. That's not the real constraint.
It fundamentally shifts the conversation, doesn't it? Away from the government's financial balance sheet being constrained by trade and towards focusing on real resources, terms of trade, and the power and responsibility of domestic fiscal policy.
Exactly.
Wow. This has been a really deep dive into a topic that is clearly far more complex and, frankly, counterintuitive than the headlines often suggest. Thank you for helping us unpack these sources and this MMT perspective.
You're welcome. It's a prime example, I think, of how understanding the operational realities of money and a sovereign government's capacity can completely change how you view common economic concerns. What looks like a problem for a household or a non-sovereign entity like a state or a country in the Eurozone,
Like running a deficit or having debt held by outsiders.
is fundamentally different for a government that issues its own free-floating currency. The standard narrative often misses the point that imports are real benefits and that foreigners holding dollars is primarily a consequence of their desire to save in that currency, not necessarily a burden imposed upon the issuing country.
Okay, so based on everything we've discussed here, that a persistent trade deficit reflects the rest of the world wanting to save dollars and means the U.S., for example, is receiving a net inflow of real stuff. Consider this final thought.
Okay.
What if, instead of instinctively fearing trade deficits or trying to force them lower through things like protectionism, a country with a sovereign currency should maybe see them as, well, a potential opportunity, or even a kind of gift from the rest of the world?
A gift. How so?
Well, an opportunity that, if domestic fiscal policy ensures full employment, could actually free up domestic real resources, labor, factories, materials that would otherwise be producing exports, free them up to be used for other things like maybe crucial public purpose investments, infrastructure, healthcare, education, R&D, whatever the domestic priorities are.
Using the import gift to fund domestic goals.
What does that perspective imply about how we should really be thinking about international trade discussions and, perhaps more importantly, prioritizing our own domestic economic policies?
That is definitely something to mull over. Keep exploring, keep questioning.